Welcome to the Jig is Up podcast with your hosts, Darcy and Jason. The Jig is Up is recorded on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the lands of Treaty 6 nations. We aim to bring you new perspectives and open up conversations about Métis politics, culture, and current events, as well as stories that affect Indigenous from all over. If you like the show, or you don't, or if you want to send us suggestions for guests or topics to discuss on the show, feel free to email us at métispodcast@gmail.com. And be sure to follow us on all of the social media at Métis Podcast. All right, welcome back to The Jig is Up. My name is Darcy, and of course, this is Jason. How's it going, buddy?
Good. How are you doing today, man?
I am doing lovely. It is a great morning. I think it might even be sunny today. So,
is up here, clear sky, sun is shining. It's not even that windy today, which was good. We've had a really windy last few days. So
yeah,
kind of unusual for us.
We've had kind of like you'll get a nice day and then 4 days of rain, and then a nice day and 4 days of rain. So yeah, it's been fun. So the big news is the Black Lives Matter, the protests. And I just personally, I kind of wanted to just talk about it a little bit because I've been going to the rallies here and doing some video and stuff like that. And, you know, I mean, this is huge. Like, this puts the LA riots kind of to shame back in 92. Like, not to shame, but like the size wise, I mean, this is international. This is, I think I was reading last night, like every single state in the United States has had protests in every major city. Like, it's pretty massive. So, and I mean, I fully support the whole Black Lives Matter thing, just because I think, you know, minorities like Indigenous people and certainly Black people get shafted when it comes to the colonial state. So, I mean, that's where my support is, and I don't know how you feel about it, but
well, I mean, you have to support the whole construct. I think what this really shows, from my perspective anyway, is how big of a problem, especially in the United States, segregation still is. And I have an interesting story. We had a little bit of vacation about 6 or 8 months ago. We went to Vegas for the weekend, the wife and I, and we happened to be in a pub and was chatting up a woman of color who was from New Orleans and had moved to California. And so I asked her, because I've been to New Orleans before, how she thought it was growing up there. And she actually said to me that New Orleans for her was still very segregated. And both my wife and I were quite shocked, because this is, you know, it's 2020 and you have a woman of color using the word segregation in a sentence to contextualize modern life. And I think that's such an American experience on a comparative scale. We have family that live in the UK and Ireland, and they are very supportive of what's going on in the United States, but for them it's very baffling, because it's not that they are racist free at all. It's just not the undercurrent that it is in the United States. There's not that vocabulary and language that the Americans themselves use in their own context. And I think that's what's really alarming in the modern age. We live in 2020 and we have people who still use these kinds of words to describe, you know, their childhood, their upbringing, right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's maybe that's why a lot of people think, you know, here in Canada and other places, like, oh, this stuff doesn't happen here. It does happen here. It happens here every day. But I think because we don't have the amount of people, the neighborhood, like the economic diversity of people to the extreme that the United States has, I don't know if people just don't recognize it because of that. But it is interesting, because it is viewed by a lot of people like this is an American problem. Even though, and you know, you even have people like Rex Murphy coming out and saying, and Doug Ford saying, well, Canada doesn't have any systemic racism at all. It never has. And like, I can't even fathom saying those words and not being a joke, first of all. But to publish articles or to go out into a press conference and say these things is baffling to me. But that's the reality. Is a lot of people, and I think the majority of Canadians, for example, would say, "Oh, we don't have this problem in Canada."
Right.
So
Well,
it's interesting because I think it maybe is forcing some people to realize that we do have these problems in Canada, and they've always been here.
yeah. And I think that honestly, having conversations with a lot of people online and especially offline and seeing what people are posting, it's interesting times we live in. I think the longer they can sustain the pressure, the better it is, even for Canadians. I've seen so many people begin to have the discussion about what it means to have privilege, what it means to have, to have 99 problems, but my skin color is not one of them,
Yeah,
you know, um, conversations. And I think that's meaningful and impactful for even Canadians to have and begin to discuss what it means to have privilege and what is that actually in the Canadian context.
absolutely. And I think I mean, for a lot of folks, especially Indigenous folks that I know, it's actually, it's kind of a time of like empowerment, but at the same time, it kind of brings up a lot of that stuff, and it's stuff that a lot of people deal with and talk about every single day. But now you're seeing it on a bigger scale, and I think brings up these issues and it forces people to have conversations, which in my opinion is a good thing. The more we talk about this stuff, the more people might understand what's really going on out there. Because I mean, it baffles me because I've even heard people be like, "Oh, I've never heard of anything like what happened to George Floyd." I'm like, "Were you not alive in '92? Like, I don't know how you missed the LA riots. I don't know how you missed this stuff happening like throughout history. I mean, even Martin Luther King days when they were protesting peacefully, there were still water cannons and tear gas and violence, right? People got killed and just for protesting. So to say, "Oh, I didn't know this stuff was happening," I think I mean, I don't know what kind of hole you must have your head in to ignore all this stuff, but it is surprising how many people simply think this stuff doesn't happen in real life.
Well, again, it goes back to that discussion of privilege.
Yeah.
People only have to know what they want to know. I think the challenge is people are grappling with that.
Yeah.
People feel overwhelmed by what's going on, and I've heard several people say, "Well, they just can't emotionally handle all of what's going on, and so they don't watch or they don't tune in too much." But that's a privilege. See, that's you get to have that privilege where because it's not directly affecting me, I don't have to, you know, pay close attention. I don't have to be bombarded. I can keep an emotionally good center by not paying attention.
Yeah.
But that's because I have the privilege not to, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I mean, for most folks that face racism and racial issues, it's a daily thing. I mean, you look Indigenous, you go to a store, you're getting followed. You're going to get pulled over more by the police. You're going to get stopped and you're going to get ID'd more at bars and liquor stores or pubs, or like it's just everything. It's a daily thing, right? And so it is very much a privilege point to be able to like be, "Oh, I'm just going to ignore that and pretend it doesn't happen and continue to live in my little bubble."
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's difficult. But one of the things that I've been really impressed about with Calgary and the rallies I've been going to is just the magnitude and the size of the amount of people that are attending these rallies, and I guess they're protests here too, but they're obviously in solidarity support kind of thing. But yeah, no, I think and I don't know, I've been impressed with how many people have turned out. It actually made me feel better kind of going to the rallies, just because you're online and you see people support it, but you don't really know if people would actually get off their couch away from their laptop and go support something. So to see like 1,500 2,000 people showing up to something is pretty amazing here in Calgary.
Well, and I think so. And I think it's nice to see that around the world. We've seen massive outpouring of support
Yeah.
because racism isn't localized. This isn't
No,
an American singularity.
absolutely.
Um, and so it's a good thing. I think that the longer this can go on, the more pressure it can sustain, the more hope there is for actual real change
Yeah.
as time goes on. But I think it is going to be a time issue. Sadly, we're going to have to change laws. We're going to have to change
Yeah.
perspectives, and that doesn't happen overnight. You know,
No.
I think that the challenge in Canada is Indigenous people still face an uphill battle, and will even after this, dies down, simply for the fact that we don't have the same critical mass. We have, I think, in some ways, a more entrenched, normalized sense of segregation in Canada when it comes to Indigenous people.
Yeah.
We have this attitude: Indigenous people live outside urban centers, on reserves, on their own land, insert air quotations. And so there is this systemic sense of segregation that Indigenous people are still other. They're outside, civilized cities and
Yeah.
civilized spaces, and so we have a long way to go yet.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have to come to terms with the fact that I think we have to come to terms with our racism here in Canada. Like when you look back at things like Oka and Gustafson Lake and Wet'suwet'en and things like that, like these things happened on Canadian soil. They were escalated by the authorities. All of these started out as peaceful things. I mean, in Gustafson Lake, it wasn't the Indigenous that were planting roadside bombs. It was the RCMP. When you look at Oka, it was the RCMP that escalated and allowed people to throw rocks at cars with women and children in it and throw racial slurs around. You go to the East Coast where the fisheries were running over Indigenous fishing boats at one point with people in them just because, that you were Indigenous, you can't fish. And even the fracking protests out on the East Coast and stuff. So like this stuff happens. And I think, like you said, it's like a normalized thing where we've become as a society, as a country, so used to being racist towards, for example, Indigenous people, that that's par for the course now. Like that is the norm, and I think it's sad, and I think that's why it's hard for a lot of people to see it. But the reality is, I mean, if you step back and take an objective look at almost any news article about Indigenous, it's latently threaded with racism. I mean, even in the articles, and you're seeing it now too with like Black Lives Matter, where it's, the president calls these people thugs. But if you're white with AR-15s and you show up and you're pushing police and you're screaming in their face, well, those are good people. There's good people there. But this group is thugs. And we do the same thing here where, if somebody murders an Indigenous person, they're like, well, the murderer was, he was a family person, or he was a quiet fella or something, like it's this really soft language. And then you get like the mugshot or the worst picture whatsoever of the victim. And, unfortunately, that is racism. That's kind of sliding that bias again and continuing that thread of like just the subtle, way of making sure people understand this guy's the thug and this guy really is the victim here because he was such a good guy. And you see that every time, right? So it's more subtle, but it's still there.
And I think that's what I think is the positivity I would put on this, is that the size and the scale of what's going on is forcing people into uncomfortable conversations.
Yep.
Let's hope that actually pays off.
I hope so. I really do. And it's interesting too, because like you're seeing a lot of people too, like, oh, why do they have to riot and stuff? And for first, let's pretend for a second that all of the rioters are actual Black Lives Matter protesters and not, other people taking advantage of the situation to get some Gucci bags or something like, or, even police instigators. Let's pretend it is actual real protesters. They protested peacefully and you mocked and ridiculed them, like Colin Kaepernick and, all the basketball players that wore I Can't Breathe shirts. And like, these are peaceful protests that were vilified and shunned. And these people were made to be like monsters because they were trying to protest during the national anthem, that's disgusting. Then what do you expect them to do? What's the next level? Like, you're not going to listen to them when they peacefully protest. Well, then the only way to listen to people is to get anybody to listen is to go to the violence. And so to me, it's like, I don't promote violence, but I understand if you're not getting heard, you've got to do something to get heard. You've got to do something to get change made. In 92 is the first time we really saw this videotaped, this police systemic racism within police departments. But since then, what has really changed? And honestly, not much. Not much has changed. I mean, you still have RCMP that are taking down, 60-year-old Indigenous elders, and just because. You still have all of that stuff going on in the States on a daily basis. I mean, you go to YouTube at any given moment and type in police violate rights, and you're going to get thousands and thousands of videos of police doing exactly that. I watched one yesterday. They're beating up some 14-year-old black kid because he jaywalked. And they needed to not only arrest him, but like violently arrest him. It's like, for jaywalking. like these aren't major crimes here, And so it's things like that I think, it's been going on and no change has happened. Change needs to happen. And I think when people get frustrated and people get to the point where nothing and nobody is listening, well, you got to do something to get people to listen. So I don't know. I can understand the escalation to violence as much as I don't want to see that. I don't know. It's difficult.
I have a little bit different perspective on that, only because I love history and I love to find out how did we get to here. And the truth for me is, if you look at the history of colonial structures in Europe, the only thing that the European mindset and power structure has ever responded to is violence.
True.
It doesn't matter whether it was governmental change in England, and you can talk about the religious reformations. You can talk about, that's how they have done everything, was through violent means. You look at England's relationship with Wales, Scotland, Ireland, is one of violence and oppression and suppression. So
absolutely,
the real truth of the matter is, while the power structure always, shuns and bemoans and whines about the violent, it is by definition oppressive to those who aren't violent.
Yeah.
The only way within the colonial power structure to be heard is through violence.
Well, and you have great examples on this soil, even in North America, of that, where the Civil Rights Act was only passed because there was like 11 days of violent protests. And, women's rights to votes was through riots. Lots of stuff like that. I know there was somebody listed out like 10 or 15 examples of where it had to go to violence before any change was made. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that is what they respond to.
And it's historic. Look at Pontiac. The English only, sat down and decided to actually have a conversation was because they were losing to Pontiac. They were violently taking over forts.
Yeah.
Then they sat down and said, let's make wampum.
Yep. Absolutely. And when you look at it that way, it's like, well, how can you not go to violence when that's the only language that the oppressor and the colonial structure understands?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many people have worked for peaceful solutions over the last 50 years in both Canada and the United States to fix these racial issues for Indigenous, for people of color in general? And we're still at a point where police, I know here in Calgary, police will stop and card and question, 3 people of color, teenagers that are hanging out, as opposed to the 3 white teenagers hanging out over there. You're seeing news reporters getting arrested. The black crew is getting arrested, but the white crew is left to report. Like, these things are happening. They've been happening. And there's been, I'm going to guess and say, thousands of people that have worked for peaceful solutions to change laws, to go through the process, to put in bills. But nobody's listening. Nobody's doing anything. And so violence is their only language.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
especially
for me,
corporate violence, like violence against these massive corporations, especially. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so for me personally, when people say that they're not going to support the protests and they're because of the violence and they lose credibility when they become violent. That's the language of the oppressor. No oppressor wants to be violently overthrown.
Yep.
And so you suppress violence to maintain the status quo. That is the history of European colonialism.
Yes.
So
Well,
when
and
people
it
tell
goes
me
back
that,
to that privilege, right?
and that's what it's about. The language of privilege, saying I don't support people who are violent, means
Yeah.
I don't support anybody who actively seeks to violently overthrow my position.
Well, and it's funny because we're all, a lot of these same people would say, yeah, let's go to Iraq and go fight a war and stuff. So they're okay with violence on other people. Just don't bring the violence here against the systems that they're comfortable with.
Right.
But as
so
long
we'll go
as
to Iraq. That's right. So we'll go to Iraq and we'll violently overthrow their oppressive government.
Yes.
We did it in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
and, even this year earlier, we almost were to, the Americans were to war with the Iranians.
That's right.
They're seen as an oppressive regime.
Yeah.
So we have no problems liberating the oppressed with violence. We just don't like to look in the mirror and believe we live in a society where we too oppress minorities in segregated parts of our own societies.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I mean, I'm going to another rally on Saturday, which I suspect is going to be a fairly large rally because it's a weekend. It's a little later in the day, so we'll see. I mean, it's just interesting, but it is also nice to see a lot of the support coming through. Like I said, the sheer size of the rallies here in Calgary. I think Edmonton's had some as well. But it is kind of amazing to see how many people are coming out to support. Like you said, worldwide. I mean, I was seeing like in Paris, there was like 10,000 people marching and stuff like that. So like, this is something that hits to the core, I think, of almost everybody. And whether you want to side on the side of the oppressor, that's your choice. But I do think, I do hope that we actually see some change starting to happen with this. How much hope? I don't know. Because the cynic in me still goes, yeah, but will it change? I don't know.
I think for me, the positive takeaways, like I said, I see a lot more people having the conversation about privilege, what it means to be, what does it mean to have 99 problems and your skin color is not one conversations.
Yeah.
I think that's good. Am I hopeful that that's going to lead to wide sweeping, long lasting change? Probably not. Is it a start to a conversation that hopefully we can sustain to bring about change? Yes, I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I hope that it is a sustainable change. I hope we see it filter out through laws. But at the same time, you have to, there's a part of me that doesn't see this really changing much, because you do have leaders like Donald Trump. You have leaders like Jason Kenney who are absolutely blind to this. They don't care about it. They're not willing to change. I mean, and that's just the reality. And there's governments all over the world that are like that, where they're comfortable because they have all the power and all the money. Why would they change that? And so I hope that it does, but
Well, I think, and that's the hard part in the Canadian context. Sadly, the minorities, even Indigenous people, are a minority, and so Jason Kenney represents for us in Alberta the majority, and he's comfortable in that.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be very difficult for minorities of any color to really get a voice heard in this province, and especially I think in all of Western Canada.
Yes,
for sure, simply because there's not the majority.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on from that, there was a couple of things that I saw online. They were specifically Métis. So we're going to bring it back to the Métis here. And one of the things, we talked about this before with COVID and the Métis Nation of Alberta's association getting $7.5 million. And according, I think my audio is going down. According to the federal government, that money was supposed to be for all Métis in Alberta. However, that money did not filter out to those northern communities that decided recently to break away from the MNA. And I think, some people are like, well, they're not part of the Métis Nation, so they don't get any money. But the reality is a few months ago or maybe a year ago, they were part of the Métis Nation. And just because they broke away doesn't mean that they stopped being Métis the minute they sent their membership cards back. But that's the attitude that the MNA has, and that's the attitude of a lot of people as well. They're not part of the Métis Nation. So, and again, we can go back and we can make bigger questions on this, like what is a nation then? If somebody decides to move to a different geographic location, they're suddenly not part of the nation, which is proven because you have Red River Métis all over the country that aren't able to join any groups because they don't live in a province with a group. And so there's those questions, but specifically cutting those organizations out in the north out of COVID funding, I think honestly, that's got to be one of the lowest acts of low when Métis people are struggling to begin with in those communities. I mean, we were up there. We've seen how some of the people are living up there. They desperately need help. And here's another example where the Métis Nation of Alberta says, nah, screw you. We're going to keep all the money here and just disperse it to who we want. So I don't know. I don't know if you got a chance to read that article or what your thoughts were, but.
Well, again, you start off talking about people in power, positions of power and positions of authority, and what do they do with that? Are they there to help the people? Are we, and this is a great example. If you look at the privilege that the MNA has, being a government-funded organization that's there to supposed to work at behest of the Métis people, and yet look what really happens in this is they use their position of power to do nothing more than further their own political agenda in trying to make this homogenized Métis identity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a breakaway group, if you're unsatisfied with a single Métis party system in the MNA structure under the Societies Act, well, then I guess you're just out in the cold and you're not really Métis, and all these other conversations come into play. But it's really, this is a privileged power structure that the MNA enjoys because of the government, and now they use it to basically beat everyone into submission through finances.
Well, and I think it's a great example of what we've talked about at least one time on all of our shows, is how the government is more than happy to work with these types of organizations because it reduces their fiduciary responsibility. So they give them $7.5 million, knowing that the Métis Nation's only going to give that first to their members, but even there, you're probably even going to be more selective and more selective. And so for the government, they don't have to give 10 million because they figured whatever math they figured out, 7.5 was good. But if you include like the other, 2/3 of Métis in Alberta that aren't part of the club, well, then suddenly you might have to give $10-15 million to make these levels equivalent, right? And so it's a great example of the government more than happy to send them a buttload of cash, making sure that their fiduciary responsibility is maintained at a low rate. But they can say they consulted and they worked with the Indigenous, and this is what it is. And so the government's kind of off the hook because they checked all their check boxes, and knowing full well that money was not going to go to anybody except who the Métis Nation of Alberta's organization and management team want that money to go to. So it's a great deal for the Canadian government. And again, we may have talked about this before too, but these people that are in these organizations that are leading them are just say yes. They say yes to what the government wants. And I think this is just a really good example. Like, it's a very tangible example of the government purposely reducing its fiduciary responsibility, in my opinion. So.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in Alberta, we have, according to those same government stats, so the same people providing the funding who are actually tallying the number of Métis people in Alberta, we have over 100,000 people who self-identify as Métis, which is one of the first criteria under Pali.
Yeah.
Whether that is valid or not, needs to be followed up on the other 2 points. But the reality is there is a lot more owed to the Métis people in Alberta than the MNA's membership.
Yes.
And then you have organizations inside of there, communities inside of that organization, who, because of mismanagement and because of the way that that organization has been run, felt better off on their own.
Yeah.
But somehow now that there's government funding, that funding, instead of being used as a way to help the people, the individual, it's being used as a way to punish the community.
Yes.
And that should be quite horrifying to Métis people.
Yeah, because what is this signal to communities that were maybe thinking, maybe we should break away from the MNA and regain more control over our community and what we do in our own lives. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should join this other organization that has started up because of the breakaway of these communities. It kind of says to them, well, if you break away, you'll like you said, you will be punished because you won't get any more money anymore, even though the money is supposed to be for all Métis. So, like, it's a really easy way for the MNA to get that message very clear that you break away and you're out of the family now. You don't get any money. But if you stay, oh look, we have $7.5 million this time. It is very much a punishment for those who have decided to take control of their own lives and their own destiny and actually follow the principles of UNDRIP, which is that Métis and as Indigenous people can choose who we want to represent us. But here in Alberta, there's only one option, or there was. And it's made very clear by both the federal government and the MNA that if you choose option B, well, you're cut out of the pie completely and ignored, because the federal government didn't send any money to those northern communities on the scale that it did to the MNA. I mean, they applied for some community grants through CERB, just like a bunch of other Indigenous communities did, and I think there was 5 or 6 of them. They got $100,000 or something. But when you think about, like, they're trying to actually serve their community, that's just not a lot of money. I mean, $100,000 when you're talking about trying to help people pay for rent or get through a tough time because they got laid off, it just doesn't go very far. So it very much is a signal from both the federal government and the MNA that membership has its privileges, and let's keep that in mind. So,
no, I think that's exactly right. That the government's using the MNA to punish, maintain, and absolutely right, reduce their responsibility to Indigenous individuals.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think this is a good little segue into a post that I saw from Will Gooden, and he's talking about the destruction of the Métis Nation by Portra and McCallum, and how this is just the end of things. They've allowed everybody to join the Métis Nation now. They recognize anybody and everybody, and anybody can get membership. And so now the world is coming to an end for the Métis Nation. And I think it's hilarious considering how the Métis Nation in Alberta continues to treat its like Métis people in Alberta with this isolating and this punishment and this, if you're not in the in crowd, then screw you, and all these kinds of things. And yet he's coming out saying, no, they're letting anybody in and they're ruining the nation. But these are all tactics, and the way they run the Métis Nation of Alberta is how they all run their organizations, because they're all part of that same cartel. So Will's just mad that they're not doing what the MNC dictates and lays down as law. That's what he's upset about, but they're still operating just like the cartel organizations that are still in the good books, like the MMF and stuff like that. So I think it's hilarious that he's signaling the end of the destruction of the Métis Nation by these organizations that are then discriminating against their own, just like the Métis Nation always does.
Well, and I think it's a great press game. I think Will's very good at continuing the hype train for this problem that they perceive with the MNO. That somehow, because Alberta and Saskatchewan support the MNO's more inclusive idea of who's Métis, that suddenly all the bylaws in Alberta have changed, and
Yes.
you know, suddenly Darcy and our applications will get approved,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
and will be included in the exclusive money club. You know,
Yeah.
that's the language that's being thrown around by the MNC and its councils and Will Gooden, is that this is what's actually happening. That suddenly the MNA's membership is going to balloon up to the whole 100,000 people who claim Métis identity in Alberta.
Yeah.
But yet, what is the real truth? Well, the truth is there's no change in their bylaws for membership. There's no change in the
Not at all.
criteria for who can be members. So Alberta specifically hasn't changed anything in regards to who is considered to be Métis by their standards. So Will's statement is, again, highly inflammatory, completely inaccurate, and is nothing more than an alarmist conversation they're trying to perpetuate to continue to do what they do on a grander scale. So just like we talked about Alberta and our northern communities, the MMF and the MNC are trying to do the exact same thing to the Métis Nation of Ontario.
Well, and when you look at what the MNC is doing, like they're embracing this new group up north, and they're really buddying up with them because of the fight that's going on with the MNA right now. So the new group has supportive platitudes from the MNC, but Alberta, the Métis Nation of Alberta, does not. And so it's like the Métis, and I think we've talked about this many times, but the Métis Nation's mad at the northern group for doing exactly what they're doing to the MNC, and the MNC is mad at Alberta for doing it, but happy that these guys are doing it. So the whole thing is just a massive cluster. And really what it boils down to is people trying to hold on to that power structure. So the MNC wants to be the dictator at the top, and everybody just follows orders. You're all just soldiers from there. But these provincial organizations are saying, well, no, if we're negotiating with the federal government on our own, if we're negotiating with provincial governments on our own, if we're negotiating with our own communities on our own, well, then what does the MNC offer? Why should we follow their rules? And so it's a very interesting and weird thing that the MNC and Will Gooden and the MMF are so unhappy. But when it boils down to it, it's just the reality is it's because it shakes their potential power structure within the MNC. Because let's face it, everybody knows that like Will Gooden and Chartrand and these guys are kind of on the fast track to take over the MNC when as Chartier leaves, and so they're wanting that power, they want that esteem, and suddenly if these provincial groups go, well, we can kind of do this on our own. Well, now what happens? Now where's that power? Oh my God. God forbid. I won't be able to make $500,000 a year working for two different organizations anymore. So go ahead.
The big reality, the truth is what they're afraid of is the very thing they perpetuate. And that is a further reduction in the government's fiduciary responsibility.
Yes.
If these communities continue to break off and leave and the MNC becomes segregated down to provincial levels, well, then the government can reduce its responsibility not to a federal organization, but to little provincial organizations.
Yeah.
And so the very game they're playing is starting to turn the corner and might bite them in the ass, and they're not so happy about it anymore.
Exactly. And it's just going to be constant fighting now. And anytime anybody does or says anything that the other one doesn't like it's just going to be constant infighting. But they are, like you said, reaping what they sowed. I think back in 1990, you probably could have predicted this implosion just based on the fact that when it comes to a pile of federal funding and all the money that's involved, it's eventually going to implode. Because people are going to get greedy, people are going to get jealous, people are going to get unhappy with the structure. When you have a president for almost 30 years, like, and nothing changes, like, these are the things that just cause these groups to implode, on top of the fact that they're all registered nonprofit corporations and societies. And anybody who's been involved with a society knows you can't keep the board happy. Most societies will operate for a length of time and then fold because different people come onto the board and they want to go a completely different direction. And then you have pushback and arguing and fighting, and then they just fold. And that's what happens to a lot of these nonprofit societies, is it's not built to be a functional, well-oiled machine. It's built to be the people that are on the board have the power, and as soon as they lose power, well, then things start to fall apart. And I think you're seeing that now, especially because they're all registered nonprofit societies. So none of them are governing bodies, basically. And so you don't have checks and balances. You don't have transparency. And it just starts to fall apart,
Well, and let's be honest, the only reason any of these organizations are still around is because they have had continuous leadership by the same individuals for the last 20 and 30 years.
Yes.
And now that most of these organizations have been finally forced into some kind of term limitations, we're seeing now that same thing, the beginning of the end of these organizations, because there's going to be power shifts. People want new bylaws, they want new direction. And we're seeing this infighting and this divisiveness happen because most of the current leadership is on its last or second last term.
Yeah.
So the truth is, these organizations don't have another decade left in them.
Mm-mm.
And so it's a great opportunity for Métis people to begin to have a conversation is, what does an actual Métis government look like? What is a multi-partied, multi-platform, actual, if we want to be, going down that road, democratic Métis government look like?
Yeah.
And I think it's time to move away from these societies because look at them, they're all crumbling, infighting and collapsing. This is a good time to have this conversation so we can actually move towards something that is, like you said, transparent, open, and engaging for the average Métis citizen.
Well, exactly. I mean, these organizations, you get a lot of people argue that, like the nationalists, they believe that if you allow anybody who doesn't meet these very strict guidelines on being Métis, you're going to destroy the culture. You're going to water down the culture. You're going to whatever. You're going to lose the true meaning of being Métis, which I don't understand that thought process, but that's what they believe. But when you look at these organizations now are not cultural organizations. They're political. They're lobby groups at best. And they don't even do a very effective job at lobbying unless it's for not only just their members, but their very selective group of privileged members that are in the in crowd. So it's kind of like, I always think of high school where you had like the jocks and the emo kids and the stoners. And I kind of feel like that's what these organizations are, where, yeah, you can have a lot of members. So Alberta claims to have 40,000 members. But out of that, only like 3,000 vote. So that's like the, one little group. And then out of that group, there's even the favored, groups and locals and stuff like that from the M&A. So it's just this very cliquey, very group-oriented, privileged thing. So they're not inclusive to their own Métis. They've kicked out Métis for disagreeing with them. They've, isolated Métis. I've met a lot of Métis who, at one point, were Métis Nation and Alberta members, probably still are on their roster, but they want nothing to do with them, and vice versa. The organization wants nothing to do with them. And it ranges from age from 20 to 70 that I've met. And so you just have these organizations that they're not really accountable to anybody. They're not cultural. They're not preserving the culture. I mean, they say they are, and they throw a few bucks at a museum or at this or that. But the truth is like the Métis Nation of Alberta spends more on stationery, I think, than they do on cultural events. So to say that, these other Métis are the ones destroying Métis culture. I don't know, when the Métis Nation of Alberta puts a post out saying, hey, anybody know how to build a Red River cart? What kind of Métis organization is it when they don't even know the resources or the people that are upholding the culture? And so, like, they're just not cultural organizations. So at this point, even if they were letting in everybody that claimed to be Métis, even if they were letting them in, what's the difference? How's that going to change these Métis organizations? Are they going to change their cultural events? Are they going to stop jigging? Are they going to stop playing the fiddle? It just isn't true. So I don't know. Like, I think it is a time of reckoning for them as well. And maybe that's what 2020 is supposed to be, is a year of complete and utter change. Who knows?
Well, that would be nice. I mean, then we could talk about something else. But until that time, I think the reality is that's what has to happen. It should be a time of reckoning. We have millions and millions of dollars tied up in funding for programs and services that never make it to the people. And Lord help you if you actually decide to leave this one horse pony train of a singular representative organization.
Yeah.
Because then you're really out in the cold. Your identity is continually questioned. Your validity as a Métis Indigenous person is always under scrutiny. It is a form of racism almost in what these organizations are perpetuating, in the nullification of anyone who's not a member.
Absolutely. And I think the thing is like, for me, the line between, a society and an actual government is very clear for me. So if you want to be a society and you want to have your members and you want to take care of those members, do that. But just be honest about what you are. Don't claim to be a government, but then exclude people. I mean, people in Alberta seem to feel that the Ottawa excludes Alberta. Well, if you feel that way about Ottawa and the exclusion of, like, even the Western Canada, because typically the power structure has all been in Ottawa, and we kind of get the scraps that are left over because we don't have the population and density. So if you feel that way in Western Canada, imagine how it must feel for those Métis that have been outed and pushed out of, or pushed to the side by these organizations. It's the same exact thing. They've decided, well, these people don't deserve our help, but these people do, because these people never post negative things on social media, or these people never question our authority. Well, these people do, so we're not going to help them. It's just pretty sad. I mean, for me, the line is very clear on these societies, so I understand that. But for a lot of people, it isn't. A lot of people do believe that these organizations are governments, or they are there to help Métis. But let's look at the COVID help. I mean, I haven't found a single post in any Métis forum that I'm in, or group on Facebook or on social media, where there's been multiple people saying, yep, no, I got help with my rent. I got 4 months worth of rent through the Métis Nation of Alberta, or, the Métis Nation of Alberta decided to drop all the rent on their properties. And boy, it sure helped out. Like, what I'm seeing is people saying, oh, I got some grocery cards for, like, Safeway. I got a couple of $75 grocery cards, or I got a couple of gas cards, or, like, it's this weird stuff. And I don't think that's really, I mean, that helps, but it's not the help that people needed through this COVID thing. And I'm just not seeing where this $7.5 million went. People are asking, hey, who got help? Who got this money? Like, who's getting it? Because I didn't. I applied, I phoned, I called, I emailed. I didn't even get a response. That's what I'm seeing. And a lot of people are like, well, I got a couple of gas cards. Oh, I got a couple of these cards. Maybe I got my rent reduced. But it's not the overwhelming help that I think Métis people were expecting from this organization. And again, I go back to the fact that these leaders kind of hold up in their own house. And to this day, they've kind of run silent on anything to do with COVID. I think Poitras put out a couple of videos on YouTube that were all of, I think in total might be 20 minutes long, talking about their plan for COVID. but they're not there. They're not there for the people. So what are these organizations for? Government funding, government approval, government, consultation. That's what they're there for.
Well, I think it doesn't take a genius, and I'm no genius by any stretch, but it doesn't take much if you break out a calculator. It takes $7.5 million, divide it by 40,000.
Yeah.
That really should have been, if this is a transparent organization that does nothing more than serve its membership,
Yep.
and that's its membership role. And this money was supposed to go to help people in COVID, make it through these trying times, to say the least.
Yeah.
The very minimum you should have saw in your pocket was, do the math,
Yeah.
$7.5 divided by your membership equals what the support should have been.
Yep.
So even if you took out some administration funds to make sure that money got to where it needed to be, I'd like to know anybody who saw anywhere near that kind of money.
Well, and even accounting for the fact that not all 40,000 members are going to need help. Some people are financially very well, maybe not super rich, but they're comfortable. And so maybe they did need the help. So you narrow that down and you say, even if 50% of the people needed help, that's still 20,000 people, 7.5 million by 20. So, and that's being very optimistic, I think. And that's the thing, is like, you just didn't see where this money went. Like, the only thing I'm pretty sure they did, but I don't even know if we got confirmation that the money actually made it to the locals, was their Métis regions each got $200,000 to help their communities. So that's 1.2 million for all of Alberta. So if you take the 7.5 million minus 1.2, you're left with a large chunk of money still that we have no idea where that money is or where it went, if it went anywhere. So again, you've said this probably more than I have, but if they didn't do things like this, we wouldn't have a show to talk. We would have no material. We would be stuck having to actually talk about culture or talk about building a Red River cart. Hell, we might have to get you out building one if we had no show. But the truth is because they're so unaccountable, there's such a lack of transparency. The money just goes into a void and it's gone. Well, you're only left to speculate as to what's going on. And it makes our show happen, but at the same time, if you're a member and you're relying on services, like, it's probably easier and better just to go to the federal government and apply, or the provincial government, rather than even try to go through the Métis Nation of Alberta in this example.
Well, I think it's like everything. If we applied the same criteria we're talking about to any other organization, we'd probably be rioting in the streets.
Yes.
If your local school board got $7.5 million in funding to help your child make it through COVID, to pay for their computer, their classes, their internet time, the school supplies they needed, and all you had to do was apply, and your kid could get this funding. But when you went to apply, your school board had no idea where the money was.
Yeah. Oh, I think you just got muted. Oh, there we go.
The reality is, for me, you'd be freaking out.
Yes.
You'd be down, beating that school door down, say, "Where's my kid's money?"
Yep.
What do we hear from the Métis people when we have $7.5 million in funding to help them through COVID? We have nothing. We have no organization, like you said. Like, where did it go? It's this void.
Yeah.
How long are people going to continue to support a black hole of money grubbers? I don't know. How long are people going to support an organization that actively discriminates against other Métis people? I don't know.
Well, and how long are we going to go with no answers on anything? They won't. There was a fellow here in Alberta that was really trying to put forward like a Métis news kind of thing, and he would call to try to get comments, to try to get their input on articles he was writing, and you wouldn't hear back. I have called, I have left messages because I want to get answers on what they're doing. And I don't expect them to call me back because of the show we do. But at the same time, there never will be a callback, unless you're in the in crowd and you're going to do nothing but promote them and propagate the lies they tell everybody. Well, then we will do an interview with you. Or unless you're a major news organization and I can go on and lie on national TV, then we'll do an interview. But like, so there's just no accountability. I mean, here we have that judicial board that still hasn't been put in place, and it's been 2 years, I think, since they voted to reboot that. That's not how a government runs. You don't run. I mean, it kind of is, but at the same, like, governments don't just abandon the legal system and go, we're just not going to have courts anymore. And if you guys want courts, well, whatever. We're just not going to do it anymore. That's what the Métis Nation has effectively done. So, that, and then again, that's that societal privilege where they can go, but we're a society. So we do these. These are the rules we have to follow. But when it's convenient, we're a government, and these are the rules we follow. So it sucks, because I think the only people that really do get hurt is Métis people. And this COVID thing, I think, should have been a huge eye opener as far as where money doesn't go, and as well as multiple things before that. And I'm curious to see how their budgets are going to come out this year, because I can almost guarantee they're going to still have, $4,000 a day in travel and accommodations and stuff like that. But yet for like 3 months, nobody could travel anywhere. So it's pretty sad that it's been allowed to continue this long, and it will unfortunately be allowed to continue even further because the federal government just continues to funnel money into there like some sort of money laundering scheme.
Yeah. I think what we're waiting for in the Métis societies, in our Métis communities, what we're really looking for is the similar response to what we're seeing south of the border. We need Métis people to become unified in opposition to these organizations. Yeah. It's not enough to bitch and moan about it. You and I have tried on several occasions to spearhead or push this down the road, and there's just not the support there for it. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, because that's really where we're at now, that there are more Métis people outside these organizations than in. Yeah. We just need to find that unifying factor. What is it that's going to bring those Métis people together to challenge the status quo?
Well, and I think, I've thought a lot about that. Like, is it just people don't care? Is it people aren't interested? And I think what the reality is these cartel organizations have done a great job of minimizing the impact on the daily lives of Métis people, to the point where most Métis that have memberships in these organizations don't really even think about them on a daily basis, because it doesn't impact their life at all. You get up, you go to work, you come home, you feed your family, you take care of your dogs or cats, you on the weekends you're out doing things with the kids or whatever it is you're doing. The Métis Nation of Alberta or whatever province you're in doesn't really play a huge role in that. And so because of that, I think it's really easy to just be like, well, why would I go protest, or why would I waste my time on a Saturday to go stand outside the main office in Edmonton and with picket signs or take action, because it has such little impact on me anyway. What does it matter? And so I don't think it's people's laziness or lack of interest. I think it's just that these organizations have done such a good job of becoming completely irrelevant in most Métis people's lives. Like you said, the vast majority of Métis are outside of the organizations. That means they have zero impact on those Métis. So they've done a good job of stepping back and becoming almost living in the shadows, where people really don't pay much attention to them. And it's unfortunate, because there are people that do still want and need some help, or need some of the programs and services they offer, and they're not getting them because they've done such a good job of hiding in the shadows.
Well, and that brings it, yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point, because essentially the very thing people like Will Gooden are arguing is the end of the cultural identity of what they would say is Red River specific Métis.
Yeah.
Is because you can open up the membership, you're gonna have all these people in flood, and it'll be the end and the delusion of what it means to really be Métis. But the truth is, just like you said, what does it really mean on a day in, day out basis? How much does your Métis identity color, impact, or move you through the day?
Yeah.
And the truth is, we've seen the very thing that the people like Will Gooden are coming out and claiming is going to happen is already happening.
Yes.
There is no Métis culture if we're not talking about Batoche days, or when people gather in Manitoba around Louis Riel's grave. The reality is, what does it mean to be Métis when you get up in the morning? What does it mean to be Métis when you go to work? When
Yeah.
you feed your kid? When you play with your dogs? How much does your Métis identity color those things? And let's be honest, even for the 40,000 strong membership of the MNA, you're down to maybe the 3,000 that vote.
Yeah.
That you say are impactful if we had any numbers to go by. And that's a scary thing. What's going to bring about the end of the Métis people is a loss of our culture.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder now with that group that's split off in Northern Alberta, I have to wonder. I know there's not 40,000 people in Northern Alberta in these communities, but if I think it was 6 communities that have broken off now. Let's say in those 6 communities, there's 5 to 10,000 people, or even just 5,000 people. I'm curious to see on the next MNA election how that impacts the voter turnout, because I think a lot of those communities, because they are Métis communities, and you look at like Fort McKay, their whole life is about being Métis. It's the housing is owned by Fort McKay Métis Nation, and it's the land is owned by Fort McKay Métis Nation. So you wake up in the morning, you're on your own land. You're in Métis housing. I think they recently announced that everything is rent free now and stuff like that. So it's like they're living 24 hours a day, 7 days a week Métis, because they're in Métis communities. But when you get into places like Calgary, Edmonton, where these aren't Métis focused communities, these are communities of, Calgary's got over 1.2 million people. And out of that, there's what was it in Calgary, like 30,000 Métis or something. So it gets harder to have that really close-knit community. And so because of that, a lot of people just start to spread out, and then it becomes less impactful. And those are the people that aren't voting. You didn't get 2,500 votes out of Calgary. So I think it's those northern communities, it's the smaller communities that are really turning out to vote, because they're living Métis lives. I mean, when we went to Conklin, there's no doubt in my mind that those people are living Métis lives. They're forced to live out in the bush for one thing, but it's just that because they have a smaller, closer knit community, it's a very, you get the Métis sense, you get the Métis feeling when you walk in there. You come into Calgary, other than Métis Trail, there's really, like, what is there about Calgary that is like, oh, overwhelmingly Métis? Nothing. And so it gets harder and harder in these bigger centers, which is why the votes are not coming from the larger centers. So I'm curious to see, I guess, my long-winded spiel here about how that will impact the voting turnout in the next election, just because I think when you cut out those northern communities, you cut out probably at least 1,000 votes, maybe 500 votes, 1,000 votes. So it'll be interesting is all I'm saying.
Well, and it goes to show, though, that where is Métis culture? Where, in 2020, where's Métis identity? Where's the push on, being minorities in what is essentially our own lands? What is that doing for us? Is it forcing us to become a unified force? I mean, let's be honest. You can go to Fort Edmonton and go to Celtic days, and you'll see more people putting on kilts, throwing the caber than you would see at any Métis event.
Absolutely.
And that's very sad. It's very sad there's not, in our urban centers where you have 10, 15, 30,000 Métis people, we have nothing culturally going on to let even the wider world at large know that Métis people are still here, Métis people still matter.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to, these organizations get millions, tens of millions of dollars from the government, but it's for programs and services. It has very little to do with culture. Most of the time when you see a cultural event, it's supported by the Gabriel Dumont Institute, but it oftentimes is not supported by the Métis Nation of Alberta. I went out to Rocky at an event a few years ago, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, the logo wasn't on any of the, we'd like to thank our sponsors. It wasn't anywhere. Now, yeah, I think the Métis Nation of Alberta does filter some money into the Gabriel Dumont Institute. And so I guess you can say in a roundabout way, these organizations probably do support it through that. But the point is they're not directly doing it. And if they're supposed to be the government and they're supposed to represent Métis, shouldn't they be directly involved in any Métis event, any Métis cultural experience, any Métis camp, any Métis anything going on in this province? That's what I would expect. The Alberta government is. You don't go to a provincial park that, well, they're shutting a lot of those down, but you don't go to a provincial park that the Alberta government doesn't run. You don't go to events, everything is sanctioned by levels of government within Alberta. But with the Métis Nation of Alberta, it doesn't work that way. So, and I'm assuming it probably is the same in other provinces. I only speak of the M&A because that's where we live, but I'm assuming that it's the same way in other provinces. You may have some activity in the local level, in the community level, where this community might be really good at putting on events and they do a great job, but then other communities or locals aren't doing anything. Like here in Calgary, the local is trying to get things up and rolling, but they're facing an uphill battle because they don't get any real support, financially or otherwise, from their government, their Métis Nation of Alberta. So it is really sad, and I hope that, like we've always said, that people start to wake up and have these conversations, and start to have these conversations with these organizations and the people running them, if they can. But does it fall on deaf ears? I think maybe often it does.
Well, and like we said, the majority of Métis people are still outside of these organizations. And like we talked about before, the reason locals have a hard time finding traction, like in Calgary, where there's such a huge number of Métis people, is because they're still only going to engage their own membership.
Yes.
Because everyone else isn't really Métis.
Yeah.
And so for the bulk of all people who are actually Métis outside of these organizations, that's the hard part. What can we do to create a catalyst to get these people together, to make a difference, to bring unification to Métis identity and identity politics? I don't know. We've tried several things, none have stuck, but we're not the smartest guys in the room either. So,
right.
Who knows?
Well, and we did it on shoestring budgets and stuff and donations, but we still put on events. We still did things. So it is possible. I just think, a lot of times, like you said, you're engaging with a very select group of a small group of people to begin with. And especially when it comes to, if I'm going to be involved in something, but I know that I can never, ever, ever run for a position on the local, well, then why would I be involved in it? Why would I want to put my effort in and volunteer my time and do all these things? Because I can, with locals, people can. But why would you do that if you know that you can never, ever, ever be the one sitting on the board at any point in time? And so you're discriminated against because you don't have the right blood quantum and geographic blood lineage, but they encourage you to come out to their events. Well, I don't want to go to a place where I'm going to be discriminated against, or I can't ever be involved in organizing anything on the level of actually being, president of the local or even on the board on the local. Well, I'll just move on to another group. I'll go be a scout leader with my daughter and we'll go do that. Because at least there I can have a little bit more control, and I can I can be involved on a higher level if I want. I can, you look at any amateur sports. I mean, you can be involved at whatever level you want, and it's your children, but you can't when it becomes to this.
Right.
Well, then why would I waste my time?
Well, and I think you hit an important nail on the head there, and that is why don't we see the involvement and the engagement is because what does it ever benefit the community? What does it benefit your kids? What is going to change for you, your family, or even your community by getting involved?
Yeah.
Because the organization isn't about harvesting rights. It's not about land. It's not about your culture. It's not about your language. It's not about your music. It's not about your food. So what is it about? Well, job employment, access to programs and services you probably don't need. Well, then why are you involved?
Yeah.
Well, it's no wonder they got no engagement because anything that actually matters to anybody's lives, they aren't there.
Yeah.
They're absent from that conversation and those events.
Yeah.
So what is there that you'd want to get involved in? Even if it was a club that you could join and you fit the criteria, what is that club going to give you?
Exactly.
And like we've joked about before, my Costco card gets me more than any Métis card that would in this whole country.
Absolutely. And I know that people are going to hear that and probably go, oh, well, it's not about benefits. Yeah, but it kind of is. And I don't mean I want money or tax breaks. Like, I don't want to suddenly be part of the Indian Act. What I mean is and I know this is what you mean but what does that card mean to me as a Métis person? What does that card allow me access to on a Métis level? Does it allow me access to an online library of all Métis books that I can go and use that card to log in online and check out a virtual book and maybe download an Audible book or whatever? Like my library card allows me to do that, but my Métis card doesn't allow me to access any Métis authors, any Métis stuff like that. Documentaries, if there is any that have been made about Métis people. Does my Métis Nation of Alberta card give me free access to that information? No. So just little things like that where it's like the card doesn't give you access to anything cultural. It doesn't give you access to anything. So really, like you said, what does that card do? And it's not about
even as benefits when I buy my Costco card.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we talked about before, like medical benefits, they don't exist. So what does this card get you that's so valuable? And I think it's hard to drive, like you said, drive enthusiasm to do things or be part of something that you don't really see, like what value does this bring to my life? And I fail to see the plastic card where that membership in the Métis Nation of Alberta really gets you.
Or anywhere where, in Alberta, you've got a Métis card. You get to go to Métis Days. You're going down like Fort Edmonton or Fort Calgary to Métis Days because you have a Métis card, or some pancake breakfast for Métis people that happens annually. Like, what is it that being part of this organization is going to hand me and my children some kind of identity connection or privilege or event or a library or a book or a CD? Like, what is it that would be impactful to my life tomorrow morning that is meaningful? So why do I have a membership? What does this organization give me? Every club, every card I have is because there's a perk, a benefit to my life, either physically, tangibly, emotionally, or financially, for me to have it. I have a library card for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It gives me access to what the library has.
Yes.
What does my Métis card get me?
Yeah. What do you get access to? And the sad answer is not much. Like
you talked about in the whole COVID thing, how many people have, for this 40,000 people have cards, how many people got access to that $7.5 million?
Yeah. Well, and even you look at, like, they did a summer camp last year for Métis youth, but it was restricted only to members of the Métis Nation. And then and to children who already have their membership. And I think if you didn't have your kids' membership, you had to submit your like proof that they are your child and that they should have membership in the thing. But again, it's very restricted. So you have 100,000 Métis in the province, but really a very restrictive amount of those can actually access a summer camp for youth. Now, if I was going to put on a summer camp for youth, I would invite Métis people, and I don't know if I'd be checking cards at the gate. Because if you say you're Métis and you self-identify as Métis and you want to join us on a summer camp to spend a week doing Métis cultural things like learning how to finger weave and things like that, or just learning more about bushcraft or how to paddle in the big canoes as a team. I don't know if these are the things you want to do, but you don't have a membership card, you should be allowed to do them. And this exclusive, discriminatory attitude needs to change. It doesn't work for the federal government, doesn't work for provincial governments, municipal governments. It certainly isn't working in the United States right now. You cannot simply exclude people and expect people to be happy. You can't, and even the ones that are in aren't happy because they're still excluded because they said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person or whatever it is. And so these exclusive clubs eventually will have to die. They will have to go away because people are going to get so tired of being excluded. They're just nobody's going to support them eventually. And if they whittle it down to the 3,000 people that actually vote that might stick around with these organizations, then what kind of organization do you have when you represent, less than 10,000 people in eventually out of 100,000? You're not a representative organization at that point,
And again, it boils down to, for us, I think the priority is about the things that matter to your life. When it talks about Métis identity, and that's your language, your culture,
Yes.
feeling and participating in a wider community other than the singularity of my family. And what we're seeing is the absolute last nails being pounded into that coffin before our eyes as these organizations are allowed to continue to drag out, in their government funding. Because things that matter most in the perpetuation of the Métis identity are the things that are never funded, they're never promoted, and they're never fought for.
Yes.
And the longer Métis people sit idly by and watch these things go, we're going to end up, it's going to be our children and our grandchildren who have this Métis renaissance period of trying to reclaim and build back everything that we have basically let slide in our time.
Yeah.
We have endured hardship and roadside and, segregation against Métis people in this country for a very long time. Yes. However, in our own time, we have never been more funded, more represented, and yet we are more culturally stagnant and dying off every day that passes than ever before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've never understood that, because when you look at just the reality of life, if you're going to stick with this nationalistic, geographic, discriminatory plan of who is Métis and who's not, if you're going to focus solely on that, eventually you're going to eliminate yourself. Because as we move forward in society changes and populations grow and things change, people are naturally going to stop taking out memberships in these organizations, because what is the point? So if I have a membership and I'm not using it for anything, it just sits in my wallet and I don't even half the time remember it's even there, and I don't ever vote, and I'm not involved. What is the likelihood that my child is going to be involved? Even if we're a very strong Métis family and I teach her Machif and we wear sashes every day, if I'm not the one involved in the organization and I'm not volunteering, I'm not organizing, I'm not doing those things, the likelihood of my child being involved in that organization is very small. And so as time moves on and families get smaller, because we're not having 19 kids anymore, we're having 1 to 2. And as people become less involved in these organizations, as we're seeing, you have 40,000 members, but 3,000 vote. That's a big, big gap. Then the descendants of those people will be less and less inclined to do the work to get membership, to be involved. Who cares? I can go be Métis, and I don't have to have that organization tagging in my wallet. I don't have to pay any fee. I don't have to submit my genealogy every 3.5 years when they decide to change the requirements again, or the map, or whatever it is. That I don't even care. And so that's the reality. And I've always understood that. And it seems like people like Will Gooden don't. They think that if there's 100,000 members of the Métis Nation now, there's always going to be at least 100,000 members. But that's just not reality. I mean, you go back in time and you look at some of the things like, in the States, they have this thing where you can be a son or a daughter of the American Revolution. All it means is you have to be able to trace your family back and show that one of your ancestors fought in the war. Perfect. But those numbers are diminishing as generations go on. And why? Well, because people don't see the relevance to that Civil War anymore. Because these organizations are kind of like, oh, they're nice to join. And you maybe go have them, you get together once a year in your area or something, but they're not a massive part of anybody's life. There's even a Descendants of the Mayflower organization. Well, how many people are actively pushing to get their membership in those organizations right now? Not a lot, because it's just not as critical, And that's what you're going to see with this cartel is people are just naturally going to fall away because they've had smaller families. They're not as interested in these organizations, whether they're really strong culturally with their Métis roots or not. They're going to start to move away, and you're going to have the most Red River of Red Riverian Métis that is no longer part of these organizations. So I do think these are kind of, like you said, the nails in the coffin. It's the death throes. And they're fighting with each other now. They're throwing everything on the fire because they need to keep the fire going. And they're running out of things to burn. And it just seems like now they're going to burn themselves. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's crazy days all the way around. I think it's good. I think hopefully, that we can spark a conversation, that we can get people engaged.
Yeah.
Because it's a conversation I think that has to happen on a wider basis. What do we as Métis people want? What's our priorities?
Yep.
And we need to join together and build a unity outside of these organizations to really focus on what does matter. As much as I like government funding for programs and services to help people, the reality is if we lose our language, if we lose our culture, if we lose our history, no amount of money and government funding for programs, services, and jobs is going to replace that.
Absolutely. But I think that's probably enough for today. I think we've gone on for well over an hour now. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts or last hurrah that you want to get out, but I think I'm all Métis talked out for the morning.
Well, I hope people hit us up. I think if there was anything in our conversation today that sparks interest, we're always open to hear from people, to talk to people, to find any kind of grounds that we can work together to preserve what should matter most.
Absolutely. And I think if anybody has comments or they want topics for us to discuss, hit us up at métispodcast@gmail.com. We have gotten a couple of emails that, I know specifically one email, and it was asking about a certain subject. But the subject was really hard because it would require us to actually do an investigative research into the Métis Nation of Alberta and their business dealings and things like that. And the likelihood of that ever happening is zero. The truth is we'll never get answers from the M&A. Trying to investigate the M&A on a journalistic level, it just isn't going to happen because there's no transparency or accountability. So unfortunately, you can send us those kinds of emails, but unfortunately, when it comes to the organizations, we can't investigate, the Métis housing that Métis Nation of Alberta does because we're not even members. We're not allowed in, and they don't even let their members know about that stuff. So it's nearly impossible.
Well, just remember on that front, a quick note is that they're a society formed under the Societies Act, whose best information we could get is a copy of their bylaws. Anything behind that falls behind that firewall, and you'd have to be a lawyer to get that legal access to that information.
Yeah, and it has to be part of a lawsuit or legal action or police investigation or something along that lines. But I don't want to discourage people from sending stuff like that, because maybe we can at least talk about it on the periphery, or if people are willing to come on and talk about their point of view, we'd be more than happy to look at those as well. So just I encourage you always to check us out or on Facebook, social media, and to send us your comments and questions on métispodcast@gmail.com. I think for me, I'm good. And so I guess until the next time we decide to do this, the jig is up.